Hey, this is David with Hagerty. We're back on our Buick Straight 8 with a Redline rebuild update. Today we have, as you can see, basically a full assembled engine right up to the valve cover. However, at this point I have no ignition system, I have no fuel system, I need an alternator and a couple motor mounts. And a fan, of course, to top everything off. So that's our final push on this motor, is to get all those items on. I'm gonna start with dropping the distributor in and getting the fuel pump, and then move along after that. And after that, it's nothing but the beauty shot. So here we go. So, like we've talked about on this engine, a lot of the bolts, the threads are actually through holes, so that means they go into the crankcase. Typically speaking, your engine mounts are not those type of bolts. They're usually on a boss and they're a dead hole. In the case here, the top two are that way, but the bottom two go right into the crankcase. In fact, right now I can see through this hole and see the wall on the other side. So these two on both sides will need to be sealed up before I put them down. So as I go through and I route plug wires, in this particular case, the way they have to come down through the cover hole, everything's got a funnel to the center. So I can't do my kind of normal where you run them down and nice and clean and such. They tend to bundle a little bit here, but they'll be a nice looking bundle. Otherwise, just put a nice loop in them here. So I like to, put a nice comfortable bend mark to the bottom of the cap, somewhere about there, looks about right. And if you have to, put a mark, use a marker and mark them, or just grab your side cutters, lop them off on that end. And I have found these things to be phenomenal. They're both a stripper, a crimper. They work really well. These will pay for themselves very quickly, and quite honestly, they'll pay for themselves on the first set of custom wires. So don't I'll say be slow to buy these. But you go through, they're ratcheting, as you can hear. It cuts them. You just pull this off, boom. That's the end of that. And you have your center core. Take one of your terminals, and ideally, you put this on first. But every time that I forget and I put it on this way, it goes on. Maybe not as easy. They're all can be a little difficult anyway. See, still goes on. Take and roll this back or down, whichever way, doesn't really matter. Take the U to the back side. The crimper has a certain direction that it goes, like this. Pinch her tight. That's good. I typically also come back and just, especially on this thin 70 mil wires, or 7 mil, I just come and give them a little bit more so they bite in better. On an 8mm plug wire, it'll be right tight. This is number 5. I like to put it into the cap first and then just work your boot back down. And then, of course, down as far as it goes, nice and snug. There's that. Plain and simple. I usually start as well with the longest wires first. Or you can use the shortest wires, whichever you're most comfortable with. Depends on how you want to look at things and what your situation is. So, but this basically just go right on down the line. In our case, I started at number 1 and just worked my way down, but I sorted out my wires as well first of all. And then something else that maybe not everybody knows, but on your plug wires, if you could pull this back, and the inside of this, you can bend these. So you'll see here, instead of, these are considered a straight boot, but you can bend them over. Just be careful with where you bend them. There's a spot that can, and I'll say a spot that can't. On this particular one, all I'm doing is I'm using where the overlap or where it comes together at my pinch point. I know if I bend it, if I put this up at 12 o'clock, I can bend this down to 6 based on how the wire itself is designed. One of the other things that I am not afraid to do is once I have my firing order and I know where I want number 1 to be at on the cap, use some sort of contrasting color, put it on the cap. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. Write it down, put a 1 for instance, and then I wrote the firing order all the way around. And that way as I go through and put stuff on, it's just quick and easy to see it. You can also come back if you need, and you can write right on the boot as far as which one's which, or likewise up here so you know you have that connection right. Because invariably when you go through to start this up and you do stuff real quick and you miss something, the first thing you're going to do is check your firing order, and it will make it a whole lot easier. Because, well, we've been there. Most of the stuff is all on over there, so that's good. We're making huge progress today. So now over on this side, before I get to the exhaust and the intake manifolds, I need to throw on this crankcase breather, get the motor mount over on this side, and then put the generator in position, fan belt on, pulley, and a belt. And lastly, we're gonna put that oil filter up top. So, big progress. All right, so with this external oil filter, normally a canister oil filter or a cartridge oil filter would be attached to a provision on the block, so like an external casting that it would screw onto or a housing that would contain it. In the 50s, they hadn't quite decided they needed that, so this was an aftermarket, more or less, deal where you put a cartridge filter here, and then the oil line is run, you know, up from down here, pressurized here, comes up into the canister and then into the head. And it filters a portion of it. It doesn't filter all of it. That by no means could you put out every ounce of oil that a 3/16 line can supply. But that is what they did as far as going through the filter. And that filter will look like this. This would be considered a cartridge. A canister or a spin-on would be fully encapsulated and have a thread here. So what I'm doing right now is fabricating up some tubing to come into the top. I have this one done already, and it's gonna come down, gonna tuck against the block, ideally, come down and around and then into here. But of course you see that it has to make a tight bend here, has to make somewhat of a bend here, pass through all this, and basically make a 180 coming into the block. Now, doing that will require a tubing bender or a mandrel bender. I get two styles here, one with a little tighter bend and a lot more use, and then this brand new one, or virtually brand new, that has a little slower radius, because the last thing you want to do is try to hand bend it, and you'll see I can help it. I can do decently by holding it with my fingers, but normally what happens is you do this because you're bending it and you pinch it. If you pinch off the oil flow, well, I shouldn't have to tell you what happens. It won't work very well. So you do not want to do this. No different if you were using this tubing for brake line or oil line or transmission line. So there we have it. And then of course the key is when you flare it, make sure the nut's on there. Got that. Some pretty nice Cerakote here. West Michigan Cerakote. Beautiful. We are putting on the intake manifold and our custom exhaust header. Now, because of what we were asked to do on this engine, basically it needs to be a hot rod engine, but period correct, basically. So that is where we're at. So one of the things we picked up was this custom Edmunds intake manifold from the day. And we've polished it, we've had to modify it, we've done some other stuff to it to make it work. Mainly relative to the carburation that we're going to use, and then of course with the exhaust manifolds that are going on it as well. So we have these custom headers that were built and go around everything hopefully today. So they'll sit in like this, goes around the engine mount, and then of course we had a couple little modifications to them. Even after being custom made, there were still a couple interference issues relative to the intake manifold, but I think we have that. I think we're over that hurdle. And so far without stretching a groin muscle. Now, the next fun part is going to be putting in all the studs that hold this in here, which is easy. Again, a couple of these go into the bolt holes, so we're going to put Teflon on every one of them just to avoid any issues down the road. And it's going to be quite the juggling function of holding the intake manifold up here and the exhaust manifolds up here all at the same time, because they all clamp on together as one unit. One unit, but 18 separate pieces. Along with, you know, gaskets, washers, you name it. So hopefully all my thumbs are working today and everything else, and a runaway nut. So there we go. That's what this is going to be all about. Here it is with all its glory. It's bolted on, and I'll tell you what, it was about as fun as getting chased by a wild boar. Here we have the next task. So, I'm going to tell you what, I've been itching for 6 months to put these carburetors on. These were supplied to us by Sean Murphy Induction, and Sean have been a fantastic guy to work with, and these things are gorgeous. And the second reason that these are wonderful to put on is that means I'm that much closer to being done with this thing. But given the problems, and let me grab the old carburetor here. So here's been our dilemma, or one of the hurdles that we had to cross with this Buick. So this would be the original carburetor, one of 2 original carburetors that went on this intake manifold. This is what's referred to as a Holley 3-bolt. Holley no longer makes this. Edelbrock no longer makes it for themselves. And then there's also a Stromberg version. The problem with both of them is there is no choke mechanisms that are electric relative to that. The Strombergs have chokes, but they are not electric. The request was that we had an electric choke option to make this real easy and smooth to drive, start up and drive. So with that, in a 2-barrel fashion, you use the Rochester 2 jets, but as you can see, they are a 4-bolt opposed to 3-bolt. Now, you would have hoped that we could have gotten lucky that at least 2 of these would have lined up with those, but that's not the case. They're slightly off, and there are no adapters readily available out there to just say, call Mr. Gasket and order one in and slap it on. So what I did is I went through and took the gaskets, literally. I took the gaskets that I'm going to be using. This is the base off the Rochester, and this is the base on the intake manifold. And basically I needed to get from here to here. So as you can see, nothing lines up, not the holes, not a single thing. So what I did is I took and drew these up in a CAD program and then extruded them and worked out these pieces that allow me to bolt this adapter down to the intake manifold with these 2 bolts first, and then this goes on over the top of it. One goes here, and then this goes all the way down to the intake manifold. That sandwiches the bottom one in and then holds the top in. Now I have a 4-bolt spacing that will bolt to the bottom of the Rochester carburetor. Okay? Now, so these are printed parts. I use this to prove out my design concept. Now, if I was, at the time, was been able to make these in probably an ABS plastic, I think would be compatible relative to the fuel flow going through there and the temperature, I could have stopped right there and just used these as far as a 3D printed part, but instead I took them and had them made into aluminum. So now I have an aluminum chunk, put it that way. So I have an aluminum piece that will now in turn make the transition between the two. And then again, I mentioned that the bores, this bore size on the carburetor and the bore size on the intake manifold are not the same, and the spread is not the same. So at that point, I just bolted them together and then just used a hand Dremel and cleaned out and matched them fairly well. So now my transition for airflow and fuel flow from the carburetor into the intake manifold is as streamlined as I can get. Now, back to assembly. I'm going to use a base gasket on here, like so. We'll put, this is the front one. And this goes in here like that. Now, instead of using a gasket in between, what I'm contemplating, instead of putting a gasket here, I think I might use some red sealer, which is for metal and metal surfaces, the gasket maker. And I can use that here, because one of the things I'm thinking about is, will the gasket give me a problem when I bolt down here tight and have a leak on the outside? Quite honestly, I shouldn't, because of the thickness of the material I used. It's not like I went thin. It's a 1/2 inch material. So what I could probably do also is just double up, put gasket sealer on the gasket. These will mate together real nice and tight. And then, of course, the gasket up top before the carburetor. So that's the plan. And we'll see how it works out. We got our SMI carburetors installed and our reproduction Edmunds custom air cleaners on to go with that custom intake manifold, and I'm happy with it. It looks great. At this point, obviously, there's a couple things to wrap up before we can get it running. Specifically, it needs to be on the Easy Run test stand, and then water lines and fuel lines and so on and so forth, and I'll do that next time. But until then, you know what to do. Get out in your shop. Don't feel guilty about not getting out there, but get out there, enjoy yourself, because there's a great day waiting for you when you're done. See ya.